Let's go through a time warp here to get things started. We're not going to go back very far to October 20th, 1968, Mexico City. It was the Summer Olympics. They were being held later that year because of the altitude and the intense heat, the scorching heat of the summer there. They had to put it back a few months. And on this particular day, one of the grand events of all Olympics was being held, and that was the men's marathon. And they know kind of the time that these guys are going to run it, and they send them off so that they'll be getting to that stadium and run that last lap at a little gap in the afternoon where they can be recognized and get their medals. Well, you've seen these races where they take off, and it's a tight configuration often and long strides, and they were a couple of miles down the road when one man inadvertently tripped another, and this man tumbled down. It was John Stephen Okorie from Tanzania, and he fell, and he really whacked his head pretty hard and did a lot of injury to his knee. And the other ones, of course, proceeded until medical people tried to treat his wounds, and at that point, the race was over for him. At least everybody thought it was, but once they got this bandage on him, he got up, and he started to continue to hobble his way towards the stadium. Now, he had a long ways to go. Remember, this is a 26.2-mile race. Most people don't like to drive that far if they don't have to. He was going to hobble his way. Well, the runners finished. They gave out the award. They had other events, and they were actually about to dismiss the crowd to go home for dinner and come back for some later things because it was starting to get dark when the public address guy came on and said, "Everybody stay in your seats. We have a marathoner approaching the stadium. We have to wait till he finishes." And they thought, "What are you talking about? They already done, and we've given out the medals." But sure enough, here came John Stephen Okorie into the stadium, and people were kind of horrified at first to see this hobbling man coming in with blood running down his leg, and then they realized he had been injured, but he continued the race. Well, they responded with applause that was greater than the one who finished first. And when he finally made that last lap and fell across the finish line, the medical people grabbed him right away and took him off to give him some serious treatment for his wounds. But the press wanted an interview. They really only wanted to ask him one question, and that would be the same question I would want to ask him if I were there, and that is, why? Why? When you fell, when you hurt yourself so badly, when there was no way possible for you to have any kind of a world-class finish, why did you continue? Well, they asked him that question, and here's what he said. He said, my country didn't send me 5,000 miles to start a race. They sent me 5,000 miles to finish one. I like this guy. I like him a lot. In fact, when you're around people that are into distance running and they kind of keep up with the history of it all, and somebody brings up the 68 Olympics, few people can remember who came in first, but just about everybody knows who came in last. You see, there's a huge difference between people who do great things and people who live great lives. Some would say, well, yeah, he had the right attitude. He had a real great attitude. Well, I think there's power in attitude to a certain extent, but it's a human power that is limited. I think he was more driven by the perspective that framed his whole life. And you can actually study him and find out that I'm not blowing smoke here, that this is exactly where he was coming from. As Christians, our perspective is contingent upon whether or not we have a clear understanding of where we stand with God as a result of the sacrifice and resurrection of his son Jesus on our behalf. You see, we cannot presume that just because we placed our faith in him, that we have that clear understanding of how he views us and how that should impact the perspective that we have towards the life he's called us to live. And to kind of build a framework for this, I like to go to a familiar passage if you've gone to church for a while. If you're new to church and new to the Christian movement, you're going to love this story. It's in John chapter 6, and it's the famous story of Jesus feeding 5,000 people out in the middle of nowhere. I'm going to pick it up at verse 1. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the miraculous signs that he had performed on the sick. And then Jesus went up on the mountainside and he sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover feast was near. Now, when Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked them this not only to test him, this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Now, let's just hit the pause button for a second so we understand what Jesus is doing and what he's not doing. What Jesus is not doing is trying to make Philip look foolish. Not at all. See, Jesus knew something that Philip didn't know and none of the disciples know. Even though he had actually explained it to them a couple of times, were blinded towards the reality of it. But if you remember that a couple of verses before, he says the Jewish Passover feast was near. And in a very short period of time, he would be making a beeline for Jerusalem. And when he got there, he was going to do what he came here ultimately to do, and that is to end up on a cross and take your sins and my sins and pay the price for them and sacrifice his life in our place. So he knew all hell was about to break loose, and I've got to prepare these guys not only for that, but for the aftermath of that, because he also knew that he was going to be asking these guys, giving them some tall orders, and that is to go out after they saw what the gospel is and the resurrection and what it was all about. He said, I want you to take this message of good news out to every corner of the globe. And so, except keep in mind, how much money would they have in the bank when he gave them that orders? None. How many seminaries were there? None. They didn't own any real estate. They didn't even have the New Testament scriptures when he gave them that order. And so basically, he was going to ask them to do something that from a human point of view didn't make any sense, but he was going to say, when I ask you to do something, trust me, we can do this. So he's solving two problems at once. He realized these people are out in the middle of nowhere. They need some food. We've got to give it to them. But he also wants to show these disciples, that teach them this lesson. So Philip did what I think most of us would do, and he just ran the numbers in his head, and he says, come on, Lord. 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. If we worked full time, saved up the money, and then went to the store, that's barely what we could give. Well, there was another disciple there, Andrew, who was Simon Peter's brother. And usually when we meet Andrew in the Bible, he's always introducing somebody to Jesus. And sure enough, he's doing that here. And he had located his boy, and who had 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. Now, how he figured out who this kid was, because they didn't have cellophane bags, they couldn't see it. But this boy was, his mother had the foresight to send him off to see Jesus with a little Happy Meal. And Andrew had figured out what was in there, or maybe the boy was just up close, and he kind of wormed his way to the front, and he heard what Jesus said, and maybe came to one of the disciples and said, hey, for what it's worth, here's my lunch, you can throw that into the mix. Well, anyway, so Jesus said, okay, have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass at that place, and the men sat down, about 5,000 of them, and then Jesus then took the loaves and gave thanks and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. Look at the generosity. Just make sure they all take as much as they want. You're a big fella, you have a big appetite, take more. You got a long journey back, stuff some in your pouch there if you want. And they did the same with the fish. And when they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, now gather up the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted. You see the other side of the continuum. On one side, he's generous with it. On the other side, he's also careful and a good steward. He's not wasteful. And you can do both at once. And so they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. And we remember there were how many disciples? There were 12. And so basically, among other things, besides feeding these people, Jesus is teaching them a lesson. When I ask you to do something, and there's no way you can possibly figure out how to do it from a human point of view, just trust me. And by the way, I know you have a family too. I know you have needs too, and I'm going to take care of you too in the process. Well, Jesus is a great teacher, and like any good teacher, you teach a principle. It's time to see if the people got it. You need to give them a pop quiz or a final exam on this. And so let me just kind of tell you what happened next, because you can read this in several of the Gospels, what happened next. Jesus said to the guys, look, I'll tell you what. I want you to head across the lake to Bethsaida, and I'll meet you there. I'll send the crowd on their way, and then I'll meet you over there. And so they obeyed him, and they got down in the boat. And these guys were seasoned. Most of them had been brought up in the water, and they were very seasoned about this. And he sent them out there. So and it wasn't going to take them long, a little over an hour. They could have rowed the thing. Meanwhile, he sent the crowd on his way. Then he started to pray for the disciples and for their test. And to make the test more interesting, he prayed a gigantic storm down on them. And so this massive storm hits them, and they're out, and what should have been an easy row across, they're just fighting these gigantic waves, and it's dark, and the lightning, and all that. It's frightening to these guys, and they're just kind of starting to doubt themselves and wonder, how are we going to make it over there? Now, Jesus said he'd meet them on the other side, right? So if you look at the map of the Sea of Galilee, it's kind of a long hike jog around the top. It's like you just cut across the lake. And so he takes off across the lake on the water. And if you know the story, they saw him. They were frightened to death of him, and probably some lightning strikes. They see this person. And then Peter wanted to come out to him on the water, and ultimately fell in. And anyway, and then they finally invited Jesus in the boat. And it says in Mark chapter 6:45, when they brought him into the boat, in Mark chapter, later on in 6, they brought him in the boat, and it says, then shortly after that, they were at the other side, exactly where he said he'd meet them. So they get an F on their pop quiz because they were frightened, they were worried, they were not sure how this was going to turn out. Now listen, if they were listening clearly to Jesus and taking that in context of what they just saw with the bread, they could not have drowned even if the boat sunk. Because he said, I'll meet you on the other side. This story lends itself to two types of thinkers. And I want to divide them into abundant thinkers and scarcity thinkers. Now, this is not the same as positive thinkers or negative thinkers. Not that. Because positive thinking is basically somewhat of a preached human religion that says if we just kind of believe enough about ourselves and circumstances, it'll come true. And that's putting our confidence in nonsense and emptiness. And so that's not what it's talking about here. Nor am I talking about, when I make these differentiations, the two types. God hardwires us certain ways. And one of the ways, he sometimes hardwires some people to just kind of have a natural bent to see the glass half full. And other people have this natural bent to see the glass half empty. Both are vital people. We have to have on one side those people that kind of have that vision and can see something greater and want to go towards it. But we also have to have those people that know how to calculate and run the numbers and risk factor. And it's not uncommon that these two types of people often get married. And that's a good combination because you need both. I'm kind of that half full type, but if left to ourselves, I'd have ran our family off a cliff. But I married a girl that knows how to run the numbers and risk factor. And when we work in complement and team, things go much better. I'm not talking about those kind of thinkers. I'm talking about a kind of mindset that launches from our perspective as Christians and how we see God, how we see ourselves in relationship to Him, and what difference that makes in our life. I'm really talking about that. And what I want to do is just kind of run these two types of thinkers through a couple of filters, okay? And just kind of see how they deal with certain situations. The first filter is basically, how do they view life? How they view life. And by the way, when I talk about a scarcity thinker, please know, I know how these people think very well because I can easily fall into that trap myself. I think every one of us in this crowd can easily slip into that side of scarcity thinking. You would do yourself a favor to assume you're capable of that. And when we actually, because these scarcity thinkers aren't going to grade very well in the rest of this sermon, you could easily say, oh, no, that's not me, I'm above that. Well, if you do, just one man's advice, you might want to realize you're deluding yourself. And go take an honest look in the mirror and say, oh, yes, I can, and yes, sometimes I do fall into this pattern. That's the best way to keep it in check, by the way, is assume it, that you're capable. Okay, so how do they view life? Well, scarcity thinkers, they start with a presupposition that life is a finite pie, basically. They're looking at life as everything is kind of limited. Everything's fixed. And that's because the basic starting point of a scarcity mindset is you're basically focused on where you are and the circumstances you're in and how those affect you. You're focused downwards and inwards. And even though we have given our heart to Jesus, we can easily fall into that trap of doing that. And so when we're focused downwards and inwards, then we have this very limited idea of everything. And so it's not uncommon for them to think that resources are limited. Ideas are limited. Opportunities, sometimes even love is limited. Now, when we actually relate this to what it would be like in a marriage, you could see what a wet blanket this could throw over a love story and how hard it would be to maintain an exciting love story with that kind of a mindset. And it's even worse if both allow themselves to fall into the scarcity mindset trap. And you can see how this could really wreak havoc on a church if a person like that gets into a position of influence or leadership in a church. But what about abundant thinkers? Where's their starting point? Well, they basically start with a presupposition that there's plenty for everyone. There's plenty for everyone, and that's because they're operating in their Christian life. They're basically focused upwards, and they're concerned outwards. And this is the bottom line, fundamental call that Jesus gave all of us. He says, I want you to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And I want you to love your neighbor as yourself. And this, by the way, was the core command that he gave back in Deuteronomy chapter 6 for families. He said, our God is one, and love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and so forth. And so they're focused upwards and outwards. And so when it comes to ideas, they assume they're unlimited. Opportunities are unlimited. Resources are unlimited. Love is unlimited. And this happens when this unlimited, overwhelming, incredible God that they sang so beautifully in that last song about, is his awesome power and incredible love, when he is in his rightful place in our life. And that is called the driver's seat. I was a teenager in the 60s, and I remember a book came out. It was very popular and making the rounds. I think it was written by a fighter pilot. It was entitled, God is My Co-Pilot. And see, I was a brand new Christian at the time, but even then I could calculate that. And I think, well, then you're a moron. Man, for crying out loud, switch seats, dude. Switch seats. You don't want him to be your co-pilot. You want him to be the pilot. There's a big difference when God is sitting in his rightful place in our life, which is center stage. But when this mindset takes over us, it's amazing what it does to our marriage, what it does to our families, our kids, our grandkids, what it does for our church. We had a man in our church, I go to church out in Scottsdale, Arizona, and there was a man there who has since passed away, but he was a very famous Christian hymn writer, songwriter, and he wrote musicals for Easter and Christmas. His name was John W. Peterson. Some of you older folks probably remember that name. And he was also a left-handed golfer, and I'm a left-handed golfer, so when we would golf, we would often end up in the same cart. And I had a question that was always bugging me, and I thought, if anybody knows the answer, he does. I said, John, okay, there's 8 notes in a musical scale plus their sharps and flats. Yeah, that's right. Okay, now, man has been writing original music for what? Recorded history up to this point, 7, 8, 9,000 years maybe? Shouldn't we be getting towards the end of our options? on those 8 notes plus their sharps and flats. He said, Tim, the melodic and harmonic options of those 8 notes plus their sharps and flats are infinite. He said, we could write original music for another billion years. We have not even scratched the surface. I'm telling you, that's a God thing. That's the kind of God that we've put. He put music into, he made us in our image. He put music in the middle of it, and he distilled it down to those 8 notes plus their sharps and flats and said, right away, you'll never, ever repeat yourself. God paints a beautiful sunset every evening on our horizon. And if you have a time-lapse camera and you take a shot maybe every 2 or 3 minutes, that changes. But you can never match up any 2 pictures if you put them over each other. Now, out in our area, in Scottsdale, Phoenix area, they're spectacular because we have so much air pollution, especially in the summertime, and it refracts the light, and it's just incredible. But let me ask you something. He never repeats himself. They're always one of a kind. But how many primary colors does he work with? Anybody know how many primary colors there are? There are 3. Only 3. And yet, he's never repeated himself. He's never printed 2 people's fingerprints the same. He's never striped 2 zebras the same. This is an incredible, amazing, overwhelming God that we have put our faith in. And he wants to do incredible things through us. Paul was building this case for Jesus in the first 3 chapters of Ephesians, and as he brings his argument to a conclusion, he just breaks into prayer. And in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 20 and 21, in that prayer, he said, talking about Jesus, now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us. In other words, he's in there working through us. He says, to him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen. Some ancient Christian, I think it written on the wall of a prison, these words that someone captured and has since been put into a hymn, and maybe you've heard these words. It goes, could we with ink the oceans fill, and were the skies of parchment made, were every stalk on earth a quill, were every man a scribe by trade, to write the love of God above, would drain the oceans dry, and nor could the scroll contain the whole, though stretched from sky to sky. That's the kind of God we've put our faith in, who wants to now work through us. With that in mind, how do these 2 types of thinkers view what they have? Well, scarcity thinkers have a hard time sharing, and the reason they do is because of that presupposition they start with, that life's a finite pie, everything's fixed. They're basically focused downwards on their circumstances and inwards on how those things impact them, so you're not as inclined to think otherwise. And so because they have a hard time sharing, they tend to hoard. The things they hoard, it's not uncommon for them to hoard recognition of other people or ideas that people could benefit from, or they hoard their time or opportunities. They hoard approval, power, or profit. They might even hoard love. And then when we bring this home and we're playing this out in our family, it's amazing how toxic this can look to others. You've probably heard of the helicopter parents, they kind of hover over their kids. Well, there's a new brand out there called the lawnmower parents, and they just kind of mow anybody down that gets in front of their kids or blocks any of their kids because they're focused here, now, myself, and what's in this for us. And yet that if we're followers of Jesus, that's a contradiction of the very heart of the God that we've put our faith in. And this can really kind of work us over in church. Because see, I think one of the mistakes we have made in our Christian movement is we measure, we basically grade someone's spiritual maturity by church, things like church attendance, how much of the Bible they know, how faithful they are to read the Bible, and so somebody might have a well-marked up Bible and a tear-stained prayer list, and yet they can be light years from where their heart's supposed to be with God. And because I'm attached to a church, I've been on the elder board of a large church, and I get the inside skinny on some of the stuff, I realize that it's easy for people who have put their faith in Christ and are faithful to the church who spend a lot of time becoming professional critics of God's servants. They love to sit in their biblical hot tubs, and take it all in. And they might even be serial Bible study attenders. Love Bible studies. But when things aren't going their way, they're like biblical bulimics, and they purge all that they've learned, or supposedly learned, and they react from a point of view of personal preferences and selfish needs. My wife and I were out to dinner on a New Year's Eve one time. Some couples had invited us to this nice place, and there was going to be nice food and a nice band and some dancing and so forth. And we're sitting there, and somebody came up with an idea. Trust me, it was not my idea. It's not something I would think would be fun to talk about. But they said, why don't we do this? Let's all go around and talk about what we're most looking forward to next year, this coming year. And whatever. It's not my idea of a good idea. But anyway, this one guy was there. He said, I want to go first. So he said, you know what I look forward to? I look forward to being in church, at the church we all attend, and hearing our wonderful pastor unpack the word. And then I go to this Bible study, and there's this kind of a very famous businessman who's also a great Christian. He teaches the Bible study on Monday. He wanted to go to that. He goes to that one on Monday. And then there's this very kind of celebrity Bible teacher that teaches on Tuesday. And I go to that one. And then on Thursday, I go to another Bible study, that's over closer to my work. And I just love going to these things. Well, no one told me we weren't supposed to critique what somebody said. And I said, what my wish for you next year would be? That you come to church and hear the pastor preach the word, and then pick one of those Bible studies. Pick one. And go to that. Then dump the other two, and then get some young men. Gather some young men and meet them every week and just journey with them and kind of pour into them the things you've been learning along the way. I mean, he reacted. It was like I spit in his champagne. He came after me like, how dare me, and all this stuff, and going on. And I'm just trying, what are you talking about? It seemed logical. And finally, my wife said, let's dance. And so she pulls me away from the table, and we get over there, and we started, but she gave me a fist bump because she totally agreed. Look, it's so easy to get into a comfortable, almost country club mindset of spirituality. And we don't want anyone messing with that. But when life sticks a gun to our head, it's like, we default to where we've been all along. Basically, the master of our own fate and ship and running the show, instead of defaulting to that humility and that joy and that gratefulness that God would call us to. All right, well, that's how scarcity thinkers view what they have. How do abundant thinkers view what they have? Well, they tend to hold everything they have in an open hand. That's because the God who's sitting on the throne of their life holds everything he has in open hands too. And so rather than hoard, they share resources and recognition. They share their time and their ideas, opportunities. They share power. They share profit. And they especially share love. And it is that kind of life in those first few centuries of the Christian movement that impacted that pagan world and that declining Roman Empire, when they saw these people, they're just overwhelmed with the love of God and the concern outwards. You probably heard about those missionaries back in the 50s. Maybe you didn't hear about it, but you may have heard this quote. There was a group of missionaries that were trying to reach some unchurched tribe up in the far reaches of the Amazon River, and they set up a camp on a beach, and they made contact with them. But these men of this tribe they didn't know what to think of, and they felt it was a threat, and so they ultimately killed these men and these missionaries. And so they went in to retrieve their bodies, and one of them was a guy named Jim Elliot. He's one of the most famous ones. And when they brought him out, they found his diary, and he had written in his diary that very famous quote, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep in order to gain what he cannot lose." Well, the women buried their husbands, but they came there to bring the gospel to these people. And so somebody had to make contact. It was the women that went in, the wives that went in and made contact with the very men that had slaughtered their husbands, shared the gospel with them. These men came to Christ. They established a church there. That's a God thing. But that only happens when God is in his rightful place. Well, how about this one? How do they view others? Here's another filter. How do they tend to view others? Well, scarcity thinkers have a difficult time being genuinely happy for the successes of other people, even and especially members of their own family, close friends, and associates. Because they tend to treat other people's blessing as though something were taken from them. Because you see, if life's a finite pie, if my basic focus is right here on my circumstances and how that impacts me, and I think everything is fixed, and somebody gets something nice or better than I do, then I assume there's less left for me. And this is a subtle thing. We don't kind of do the work through the steps of this. This just happens in our heart. And when we sense that jealousy or whatever, the envy, that's showing that we're not looking at that thing through the lens that God looks at us through, which is the lens of his grace. Let me give you an example. Okay, let's say we have a scarcity thinking Christian family, and they live in a kind of a let's make it a blue-collar type of neighborhood. They pay their bills in time and so forth, but they're kind of on the lower half of the middle class. They work hard for what they have. Okay, then his neighbor pulls in a brand new Land Rover, brand new. And so the scarcity guy yells, "Wow, you must have got a big raise at work." He said, No. I didn't get my grandmother. She has a bunch of money, and she's figuring she's kind of running out of runway here. And rather than the government, fight over all this money, she decided, asked us what we liked, and she gave all of us grandkids the car we like. And I mentioned this one, and she bought it for me. She tricked it out. It's got everything on it. You know what else? She paid the taxes on it, paid the plates. Well, the scarcity thinker gets upset. He said, and so the neighbor said, "You want to come over and see it?" No. I'm too busy. And he goes in and tells his wife, "Man alive, he got this new car, and it's really nice, and his grandmother gave it to him." They pass each other in traffic. Neighbor says, "Hey, how you doing?" And that scarcity thinker says, "Oh man, I can't stand that car." By the way, thin line between not standing the car and not thinking much of the driver. He comes home one day, he sees his neighbor looking at his door panel. "What's the matter?" "Oh, somebody nicked my door." Starting to look more like my piece of junk every day. By the way, this is an extreme example, and I think we'd all agree, isn't this pathetic? Right? Of course. Except we got to understand, in subtle ways, we can all fall into that same kind of thing. It's what happens when we get up every morning and we swallow that poison pill of comparison. It can happen to any of us. And what's sad is that scarcity thinkers not only, they miss out on shared blessing. They refuse to share joy. If they can't be blessed, they don't want anybody else to be blessed. And it tends to cause us to start to see others as objects and challenges or competition or obstacles rather than fellow human beings. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 15 puts it this way. It says, "See to it that no one misses the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many." And that's exactly what we're talking about, is when God's grace is missing from the equation. See, I don't question that the average Christian can say that they genuinely care and love the people up close to them, or even strangers. The problem is the missing ingredient in our life is usually grace, not love. In fact, the book on Grace-Filled Marriage, that's the subtitle of it. Talking about that missing piece. Because in most marriages, that's what I see is missing. Not love, grace. And grace in our relationship with our kids and our grandkids. That book, Extreme Grandparenting, shows us how that's supposed to look a couple generations down, and yet many times grandparents, we can blow it in our last quarter here if we're not careful. Okay, well let's look at abundant thinkers. When it comes to how they view others, they love it when good things happen to the people they love. They just love it. In fact, they love it when good things happen to anybody. Let's go to the car story again. Let's say it's an abundant thinking Christian. He sees his neighbor come in that car. He said, wow, must have got a raise. No, grandma bought it for me, paid for everything, tricked it out. It's really nice. And he said, wow, that's incredible. You want to see it? Absolutely, but I want to bring my wife over. And maybe we'll take a photo and put this on. This is incredible. And then they pass each other in traffic, and the neighbor's saying, hey, how you doing? And the guy said, man, I love that car. I love that car. It's really easy to think similar of the driver. He comes home and sees him looking at his, what's the matter? Somebody nicked my door panel. Oh, darn, wait a minute, I've got some compound. I'll be over here with my stuff. I think we can rub that out. I think we can make that look like new. You see the difference? It's like the neighbor's grandmother gave the abundant thinker the car. They're so wrapped up, they just can't seem to applaud other people's accomplishments and blessings enough. And in the process, they get to partake in that person's joy every time they see them. And this is what happens when God is in his rightful place, because we start to see people with their intrinsic value. And we don't differentiate between socioeconomic levels or IQ or educational background or skin color or body style or any of that stuff. We see people made in God's image that we are called to love. Philippians chapter 2 says this, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourself. Not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interest of others. And then he goes on to say, all I'm asking you to do is have the same mind in you that was in Christ Jesus, because Jesus was outwardly focused. And he came here and he surrendered all the privileges of his deity in order to come and take on human form and become obedient to death, even death on a cross. So Paul said, I'm not asking you to do anything that Christ hasn't already done for us. One last filter. How do they view adversity? How do they view adversity? Well, scarcity thinkers tend to take adversity personally and make life miserable for the people up close to them when they have to go through it. What does that look like? Well, complaining, nagging, whining. I have seen this phenomenon, and it just blows me away when I see it. But I've watched people actually turn their misery into an idol that they worship, that they revisit, they let define them. Their disappointments, their heartaches, their betrayals, they got stabbed in the back. Listen, if you're living life on the front lines, every one of us are going to pull knives out of our back before it's over. It's awful, but it's part of the deal. So in the process, they don't dream, and they don't want people up close to them to dream either. They don't necessarily give them permission to that. You can see how that would be so debilitating in a marriage, in children, grandchildren, in a church. Because the problem with this mindset, it's easy to fall into that trap of cynicism. And you can be a cynic at any age. But my observation is a cynic is someone who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. And when we're called as a church, for instance, to impact our community and the world and the resources that requires, I just love all these flags and how much support you are sending to so many people. But that's real money, that's real stuff. And there's, God can do incredible things through us. He can feed 5,000 with a Happy Meal. He can do even more with our stuff. So let's look at abundant thinkers when it comes to adversity. Well, look, abundant thinkers feel the pain and the frustration of adversity. They have nerve endings. They know what it's like to hurt. But they never use that as an excuse for not doing everything they can to move beyond it. What they do is they fall forward in adversity. Now, that term I just used, I actually got that from my high school football coach. I played up at Annapolis, Maryland, Annapolis High School, and we had a great football coach. And one particular heavy practice we had, it was on a Wednesday night, and it was late in the season. It was very cold. It was like in the upper 30s, but not cold enough for it to snow. But it was raining, and so we had this, we're soaking wet, and we're freezing. Our feet and our hands are just freezing. And a heavy practice is where, those of you who played the game, you know that for the first hour, you basically bang into equipment and bang into each other on drills, and then the last hour, you scrimmage, you do a full-out scrimmage. And so when he finally blew that whistle in that distinct way we knew it marked the end of practice, I was just so relieved, because all I could think about, I got to get in the shower and get warm and get some warm clothes on. But he wasn't done. He gathered us all around. He had something he wanted to say to us. He says, apparently, he wasn't impressed with the practice. He says, I think you men have forgotten the game we're playing here. He said, the object of the game of football is actually pretty simple. The object of the game of football is we hand you the ball and you fall forward. And we looked at him just like you're looking at me, like, what? He says, the key word here is fall. They're going to get you. They're going to hit you hard. They're going to rip your head off. Just make sure you're a few yards further down the field when they do that to you than where we handed you the ball. And eventually somebody falls over the goal line and we get some numbers up on the sign. That's the game we're playing. You're going to get hit. I was in a game one time and I got the wind knocked out of me and I'm down on the ground and I'm not moving. And he yelled out, and what bugged me though, everybody was screaming and yelling. Suddenly when he yells it out, it's like the whole crowd went silent. Everybody could hear. And he yelled out, Kimmel, are you hurt or are you injured? And I yelled back, Coach, I'm hurt. And what did he say? Get up. Get up. You can't play this game without being hurt. It's a contact sport. You've got to play hurt. And you know what? The Christian life, when it's lived out with Jesus in his rightful place, is a contact sport too. We have adversaries that are invisible but very real, trying to push us back and make life miserable for us. And God calls us to just keep falling forward. And that's easier to do, I think, when you're playing for the coach and not the crowd. Jesus' half-brother, James, said this in the first chapter of his book. He says, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, when you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance, and let perseverance find its work, so that you may be mature and complete, lacking in nothing. Listen, we come to church with all kinds of burdens on our heart. Some of you have had some setbacks financially. Maybe you're suddenly unemployed. Your marriage went south on you. Your kids, maybe you have a prodigal scaring you to death, breaking your heart. We all have regrets, broken dreams. The key is don't let these define you. See, we have a choice. We can diminish the finished work of Christ on the cross on our behalf and choose instead to take our cues from the worst side of our personality or our fears or our disappointments and regrets. But there's a huge price to pay, especially for the people up close to us, because we can't do that in a vacuum. The people up close to us, they'll find that mindset often steals, it discourages, it handicaps, it wearies. It allows fear to own a controlling interest in our ongoing thinking. Romans chapter 12, verse 2, Paul said, don't be conformed any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may be able to test and approve what God's will is, that which is good and pleasing and perfect. And the bottom line here is we can shift from being scarcity thinkers to abundant thinkers, and we can do that instantaneously, because many times we fall into that scarcity trap instantaneously. But I think one thing that helps is when we maintain a heart pursuit of Jesus. Now remember, he's maintaining a pursuit of us, but we need to be in pursuit of his heart. And when we pursue him through his word, when we pursue him through prayer, when we pursue him through the love that he wants to do in us, for us, with us, and through us, especially for other people up close. John 10:10 said, I came that you may have life and have it more abundantly. That's my desire for all of us. Let me close with this one quick story. After World War II, wasn't but a few years, and we were back in a pretty nasty war in Korea. And the Korean War was, there was a lot of bloody battlefields there, but one in particular that became kind of notorious was one called Heartbreak Ridge. And if you look at the mountains in a history book on this, they look like shark's teeth. And the Korean army had the home court advantage. They had the high ground. And our troops had fought hard and a long time to try and gain this ground. One particular night, the fighting was fierce, and the machine gunners, the Korean machine gunners, would kind of keep a spray of bullets, about waist high going out. And but our troops would send up flares so they could see where they're going. And one man had worked his way almost into their line when he was hit and knocked down. And he cried out in that night, I'm bleeding out, I'm dying, somebody come get me, help me. But nobody would move because, it was like suicide to go get him. But it was aching everybody's heart when they hear their brother out there dying, but they just were pinned down. But every time a flare went up, there was one guy, he was down in the foxhole, but he kept sticking his wrist up, and then he put it right down. And then another flare would go up a little bit later. He'd stick his wrist up, put it back down. And he kept doing this for a while. And then finally, he put it, and then there he took off, and he's racing towards this guy's voice. And everything's spraying around him, and he got to the man, and he picked him up, and he starts running back through, and his guys were firing away to try and give him some cover, and he got back behind the lines and got him to the medics, and the medics ultimately saved his life. Well, later on, after they had gotten off that battlefield and were recovering, the commanding officer out there said, what happened? What got into you? When he had gotten hit, and when none of us could move, but I kept seeing your hand come up. What was going on there? He said, I kept checking the time. I kept looking at the time. Because, they're over in Korea on the other side of the way. I kept looking, because I know I was waiting for it to be 9 o'clock in Kansas, because that's where my mother lives. And when I left, she told me, last thing she said, now, son, every morning, 7 days a week, I'm going to go into my bedroom, I'm going to get on my knees at 9 o'clock, and I'm going to be praying for you. And I will pray for you religiously every day at 9 o'clock. He said, I knew I was safe. Now, here's the good news. Most of us will never have a life-death situation like that we have to trust God for. But wouldn't it be nice if we just allowed him to be center stage and we trust him in the day-to-day? Even the mundane, the ordinary. Because, like I said, he wants to do wonderful things for you, with you, on you, and through you. Thank you. Come on up here, Brian. God bless you all. Thanks for letting me be with you. Hey, brother.